Welcome to the presentation. I'm Chip Cooper, e-commerce attorney, talking about the FTC's new earnings claim framework. Now, the FTC doesn't use the term framework. It's a term that I created over time after reviewing a lot of FTC enforcement actions regarding earnings claims. And you might be just a little bit skeptical about my use of the term framework. So I'd like to make my best case, my strongest case, that it actually exists so that you need to understand how to deal with it. And I think the best way to do it is to explain exactly how the FTC developed this framework over time. So if we go back to actually before 2009, we see a classic example of an earnings claim testimonial. It reads, I made a specific amount of money, obviously one that really predominated back in that period. And then we see the disclaimer that usually was accompanying the testimonial. Your results may vary. Now, the FTC at that time determined that this approach was deceptive, and they reached that determination essentially by focusing on the claim itself. I made a specific amount of money, and then the net impression of the claim, which is what reasonable consumers would infer. It would be what they essentially take away from the meaning of the claim. And it was essentially, if he can do it or she can do it, then so can I. And the FTC understood also the catch that based on data and information from enforcement actions at that time, that most either just couldn't achieve the same results or for whatever reason just didn't do it. So the FTC determined then, back in 2009, that consumers really should know what was typical regarding an earnings claim. So at that time, they introduced something new, a typicality requirement. And here it is, basically becoming the cornerstone for the FTC earnings claim framework, the beginning of the FTC earnings claim framework, as we'll see in just a minute. And you can see there, number one, the introduction of the typicality requirement. Basically, that earnings claims are typicality claims, and the requirements related to that are 1.1, that you need to substantiate that most participants actually achieve the claim results, that is net impression, or failing that, to either demonstrate or disclose generally expected results, which is simply just another way to articulate typical results. So very significant. This is the beginning. This is the cornerstone of the FTC earnings claim framework. Now we fast forward a long time up until 2022 in an FTC enforcement action against DK Automation and two of its individuals, claiming what's really not important for our purposes, deceptive earnings claims, but important for our concerns here, so unsubstantiated earnings claims. And of course, the result was a fairly significant settlement, $2.6 million. Now, the FTC really noted in its examination at the beginning of the enforcement action exactly what DK Automation's strategy was in terms of dealing with the typicality requirement. And they used essentially doubling down on disclaimers, essentially using disclaimers as max protection. And this was the approach used by DK as well as a number of marketers up to this time, a combination of two basic disclaimers. One is the results are not typical. In other words, using a disclaimer to take head on the requirement of typicality. And then secondly, another related disclaimer, essentially substantiating or laying the foundation for the first one, which is we don't track customer or participant results. So this is the strategy by DK, and this is how it actually was played out in terms of how the FTC involved themselves in examining what was happening there in terms of disclaimers. And then in just a second, we'll see the result. So here we begin a series of disclaimers. The first one simply takes head on the typicality requirement by saying that the results are exceptional and do not involve typical results, non-typical results, as a quote. Then we get into the requirement for tracking customer results. And there's a series of disclaimers here. We performed no independent verification. We do not track typical results. And then another one, we do not track or verify typical results of our students. So if they don't track, they claim that they have no basis for using any data to essentially substantiate the claims. And the FTC replied precisely regarding a failure to substantiate. And these are two specific quotes from the FTC complaint. These claims are false. That's really not important for us. What's really important is they were determined to be unsubstantiated. And then this is the real catch. Defendants do not track their customers' earnings and thus do not know how their customers fare. So if you don't track, there's no way to substantiate, which is a bedrock principle of advertising law. That is extremely important, and it led to an enhancement, an addition to the earnings claim framework. So you see phase one that was added back in 2009 in terms of section 1 and the two subsections 1.1 and 1.2. But now we see a new addition in terms of what you see there as orange text. You need to obviously comply with section 1 requirements, and number 2, track participant results, and number 3, without any disclaimers that contradict net impression, duty to track, and generally expected results. So there it is, the beginning back in 2009, and then supplemented with the addition of new requirements in 2022 as a result of the DK automation case. Now we fast forward just 1 year to 2023, and there's a follow-up decision by the FTC involving a case against Learn Inc. And you see that its decision in this case is very much consistent with its decision and rationale in DK automation. Here are two specific quotes taken from the complaint. Defendants' disclaimers directly contradict the messages conveyed repeatedly in their marketing, which were those messages were earnings claims. And then secondly, defendants have no basis for their earnings claims, meaning no ability to substantiate because they're not tracking. So here's where we are, bottom line, regarding the earnings claim framework and disclaimers, which have been used previously to essentially negate the framework. Number one, they're not your friend anymore. Disclaimers, in fact, they may be actually your worst enemy because they attract a lot of attention from the FTC. Bottom line, you simply today cannot simply disclaim away your substantiation responsibilities, and you must actually engage with the new FTC framework. So how in the world do you do it? Well, I think this theme is what you need to focus on. And I'd like to share a brief story. Back about 5 or 6 years ago, I was privileged to be invited to attend a special meeting in Washington, D.C., a limited meeting involving a relatively small number of attorneys engaged in earnings claims. And the speaker there was none other than Lois Greisman, then the head of the FTC Division of Marketing Practices. And you've guessed it, the topic was earnings claims. So Lois Greisman gave some introductory remarks, and then turned the floor open for Q&A. And of course, everybody in the room, including me, tried to pin her down in order to develop a formula that would be acceptable to the FTC regarding earnings claims and compliance. However, Lois was not to be pinned down. Every single question, including mine, was answered simply with these two words: context matters. And initially, I was a little frustrated with getting only this limited answer, but upon some reflection, I realized that it did provide not only a little frustration, but also an opportunity in terms of using creative ad copy and also creative strategies to achieve what the FTC requires under its new framework. And that is exactly what I do working with clients. I help them with compliant ad copy and also strategies to engage with and comply with the new FTC framework. So if you want a little more information, I ask you to simply look down below at the button for downloading my earnings claim guide. You'll find a lot more information there. That's all for now.